I used to believe that as long as I never touched anyone else, I was still loyal. That belief made things easier. It gave me room to breathe inside a life that had slowly started to feel too tight. From the outside, everything looked fine. Stable. Predictable. Safe. That was the word everyone used, safe. And maybe that was the problem. We had been together long enough that silence no longer needed explaining. Mornings passed with routine efficiency. Nights ended with backs turned, not out of anger, just habit. I told myself this was what commitment looked like. I told myself that wanting more was childish, that longing was something you grew out of. Still, there were moments when I felt invisible in my own life, like I could disappear for hours and nothing would change, that he didn't arrive like a storm. There was no dramatic entrance, no instant spark I could point to and blame. He was just there. Consistent. Attentive. The kind of presence you don't notice at first because it feels familiar, almost harmless. Conversations with him didn't demand effort. They flowed in a way that reminded me of who I used to be before everything became so measured and careful. At first, it was nothing. That's what I told myself. Just talking. Just laughing a little more than usual. Just feeling understood in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. I never crossed a line, not outwardly. I still went home. I still played my role. I still believed that intention mattered more than thoughts, but thoughts have weight. They linger. They follow you into quiet spaces. I'd catch myself replaying small moments, his tone when he said my name, the way he listened without waiting for his turn to speak. I hated how much those things stayed with me. I hated that I noticed the guilt didn't come all at once. It arrived in pieces. A pause before answering a question. A hesitation when my phone lit up. A tightening in my chest when I realized I was editing myself, deciding what to share and what to keep just for me. That was new. Secrets didn't start as lies. They started as choices that I told myself I deserved to feel seen. I told myself everyone needed someone who noticed them. None of that meant I was doing anything wrong. Not yet. As long as I stayed aware, as long as I kept control, nothing could really happen. That was the logic I clung to, but awareness has a way of sharpening desire instead of dulling it. I became more conscious of him, of space and distance and timing. Of how close was too close. Of how long was too long. Every interaction felt like standing near an edge, convincing myself I was only looking down, not stepping forward. What scared me most wasn't how he looked at me. It was how I felt when he did. Calm. Warm. Awake. Feelings I hadn't realized I'd been missing until they were suddenly there, impossible to ignore. I started measuring my days by those moments, even as I pretended they didn't matter. At home, everything stayed the same. And that sameness began to feel louder. The contrast was unbearable at times. I would sit in familiar rooms, surrounded by a life I had chosen, and wonder when it had stopped feeling like mine. That question alone made me feel disloyal. That I knew better. I knew how these stories ended. I had judged people who let things go too far, who claimed they hadn't meant for it to happen. I promised myself I would never be one of them. I believed that knowing the danger was enough to avoid it, but knowing isn't the same as stopping. There was a moment, small, almost insignificant, when I realized something had shifted. Nothing dramatic happened. No touch. No confession. Just a feeling, heavy and undeniable, settling in my chest. The understanding that I was no longer just reacting. I was waiting. Waiting for moments with him. Waiting for the way I felt when he was near. That's when it hit me. The line I swore I'd never cross wasn't a single step. It was a slow drift. And without noticing when it began, I had already moved closer than I ever meant to. The shift didn't happen in a single moment. It arrived disguised as normalcy, wrapped in casual choices that didn't feel dangerous until they stacked on top of each other. Conversations lingered longer than they needed to. Silences grew heavier, charged with things left unsaid. I was aware of it, but awareness didn't stop me. It only made me more careful in how I explained it to myself. My husband started suggesting that his friends stay longer. Sometimes it was practical: traffic, late hours, unfinished conversations. Other times, there was no reason at all. The invitation came easily, without hesitation, and I watched him closely for a trace of doubt or tension. There was none. His comfort unsettled me more than suspicion ever could have. I told myself that if there were something inappropriate forming, he would sense it. That he would step in. Instead, he leaned back, detached, as if whatever was unfolding no longer concerned him. That distance felt like permission, even though no one had said a word about it. The friend didn't cross boundaries outright. He hovered near them, tested their edges. Compliments slipped into conversation so naturally they felt accidental. Questions became more personal, more intimate, framed as curiosity rather than intent. I answered too easily. I noticed that immediately, and still didn't stop. What confused me most was how little resistance I felt. I had imagined guilt as something sharp, something that would force me to pull away. Instead, it arrived soft and manageable, easy to silence with logic. Nothing has happened. This is still harmless. I repeated those thoughts until they lost meaning. There were moments when the three of us shared the same space, and I became acutely aware of myself, how I sat, how I spoke, how my voice sounded. I hated that awareness and secretly fed off it at the same time. My husband's calm presence made it easier to pretend everything was balanced, controlled. At some point, the friend began addressing me more than him. Not blatantly, not enough to be rude, but enough that I noticed the shift. My husband didn't correct it. He didn't reclaim the attention or redirect the conversation. He simply watched, distant, unreadable. I searched his face for meaning and found nothing. That nothingness became louder than words. It planted a dangerous idea in my mind, that maybe he wanted this distance, that maybe he was relieved not to be the center of my emotional world anymore. The thought stung, but it also freed something inside me. If he wasn't protecting the boundary, why was I carrying the burden alone? I began rationalizing with frightening ease. People change. Needs evolve. Attraction isn't betrayal if it stays unspoken. I convinced myself that I was still in control, that awareness equaled restraint. I didn't recognize how thin that control had become. There was a moment, small, almost forgettable, when the friend's hand brushed mine. It lasted less than a second. No one reacted. My husband didn't look up. The room didn't shift. The world didn't collapse. And that was when I understood how far things had already moved. That I felt exposed, not because of what had happened, but because of how my body responded before my mind could intervene. I hated myself for that instinctive reaction, for the way my breath caught. I told myself it was human, meaningless. But I couldn't unfeel it. Later, alone with my thoughts, I asked myself whether I wanted my husband to notice or to remain silent. The answer frightened me. His silence had become a shield, one I hid behind to avoid making a choice. As long as he didn't object, I didn't have to confront what I was allowing. That I started noticing how often I looked to him during those moments, searching for limits he never set. Each time he failed to draw them, something inside me loosened. Responsibility shifted. Desire sharpened. Guilt blurred. Nothing had been declared. No lines had been spoken aloud. Yet the balance was gone. The space between us, between all three of us, had changed shape. And deep down, I knew that silence had stopped being neutral. It had started becoming consent, whether any of us were ready to admit it or not. It didn't feel like a choice when it finally happened. It felt like gravity. Like something set in motion long before I could name it, pulling me forward while my mind lagged behind, trying to catch up. I remember thinking that if I stopped now, everything would fracture. My marriage, the fragile balance we'd been pretending still existed. That thought alone was enough to keep me still. That I was aware of my husband more than anyone else in that moment. Not the man beside me, not my own racing thoughts, him. His presence pressed in from the edges, heavy and undeniable. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He watched. And in that watching, something inside me broke open and shut down at the same time. That I told myself I was numb, but that wasn't true. I felt everything. I felt exposed in a way I had never experienced before, as if my inner life had been dragged into the open without my consent. I wasn't being touched so much as witnessed. Seen at my most vulnerable by the one person whose gaze still had the power to define me. That why thoughts scattered. I clung to fragments, how the room sounded, how my breath betrayed me, how time stretched and warped until seconds felt unbearable. I searched my husband's face for something recognizable. Anger. Jealousy. Pain. Anything that would force this to stop. What I found instead was distance, a calm detachment that made my stomach twist. That detachment hurt more than outrage ever could have. It told me that whatever this was, it wasn't a mistake in his eyes. It was something he was allowing. Maybe even something he wanted to witness. The realization hollowed me out that I felt split in two. One part of me wanted to disappear, to rewind everything back to the quiet dissatisfaction I had once complained about. The other part stayed frozen, overwhelmed by the weight of being desired and condemned at the same time. I hated that I couldn't tell which feeling was stronger, that I tried to tell myself that this moment didn't define me. That people survive worse betrayals. But the truth was forming too clearly to ignore. I was crossing a line I could never uncross, and I wasn't doing it alone. That made it both easier and unbearable that my husband's silence became a presence of its own. It wrapped around me, suffocating and permissive. I wondered if he saw me as his wife anymore or as something else entirely. A test. A spectacle. Proof of something he didn't know how to name. That I felt ashamed of how quickly my body responded to attention after years of emotional starvation. Ashamed of the part of me that had wanted this before it happened. Ashamed that even now, a small, traitorous voice inside me whispered that I was finally being seen. That voice didn't last. It was drowned out by the weight of what this would mean afterward. The looks that would linger. The silence that would follow. The questions that would never be asked but would poison everything anyway. That I kept waiting for my husband to stop it. To say my name. To remind me who I was supposed to be. When he didn't, something inside me hardened. If he wouldn't protect the boundary, then maybe it had never mattered to him the way it mattered to me. That thought settled deep, painful and final. That I realized then that this wasn't about desire anymore. It was about power. About who held it and who had quietly surrendered it. I wasn't just betraying my marriage, I was being reshaped by it, stripped of the illusion that love alone defines loyalty. When it was over, nothing felt resolved. There was no release, no clarity. Just a heavy stillness, thick with consequences that hadn't arrived yet but already felt unavoidable. I couldn't meet my husband's eyes. I wasn't sure what I would find there if I did. That silence. I understood the worst part. This moment would never stay contained. It would echo forward into everything, every touch, every conversation, every quiet night beside him. What had happened wasn't just an act. It was a fracture. And I had felt it form, fully awake, unable or unwilling to stop it. Afterward, nothing was said. Not that night. Not the next morning. Silence settled between us like a third presence, heavier than anything that had come before. I had expected anger, accusations, even disgust. What I hadn't expected was how easily life tried to continue, as if the absence of reaction could erase what had happened. My husband moved through the house with practiced calm. He made coffee. He checked his phone. He spoke to me the way he always had, neutral, controlled, distant. That familiarity felt cruel. I didn't know whether he was punishing me with restraint or protecting himself from confronting something he didn't want to understand. Either way, the lack of confrontation left me suspended, unable to defend myself or confess. The friend disappeared from our daily orbit. Not dramatically. No explanation, no goodbye. He simply faded out, as if removing himself could undo the damage he'd helped create. I told myself his absence should bring relief. Instead, it left behind a hollow ache, a reminder that whatever had happened wasn't just about him. The emptiness he left exposed everything else that was already broken. That I replayed the moment endlessly, searching for a version where I could place the blame cleanly. On loneliness. On neglect. On my husband's silence. On the friend's presence. Each explanation offered temporary comfort before collapsing under its own weight. None of them changed the truth that I had stayed. That I hadn't stopped it. That part was mine whether I liked it or not. Guilt didn't arrive as punishment. It arrived quietly, woven into ordinary moments. In the way I avoided mirrors. In how I flinched when my husband's hand brushed mine, not out of fear, but out of uncertainty. I didn't know what I was allowed to feel anymore. I didn't know what he saw when he looked at me. Sometimes I wondered if he had already detached long before this happened, if what I saw as betrayal was simply the final confirmation of something he had emotionally accepted. That thought terrified me more than the idea that he was hurt. Hurt could be addressed. Indifference felt permanent. That we existed in parallel, sharing space without sharing truth. I wanted to ask him why he didn't stop it. Why he watched. Why he said nothing. But I was afraid of the answers. Afraid he would tell me that it didn't matter. Afraid he would admit that he no longer saw me as someone worth protecting. At night, sleep came in fragments. I lay awake listening to his breathing, wondering if he was thinking about it too or if I was carrying this alone. I imagined confronting him, imagined apologies, imagined explanations spilling out of me in a desperate rush. In every version, I felt smaller by the end of it. That I realized that what lingered wasn't just regret, it was a shift in how I saw myself. I had crossed a line I once believed defined who I was. Now that definition felt fragile, negotiable. I didn't recognize the woman who had justified silence as permission, who had mistaken being watched for being valued. There was no moment of resolution. No decision to stay or leave. Just an understanding settling slowly into my bones. Some things don't explode. They erode. Trust didn't shatter between us. It thinned, stretched so tightly it could tear at any moment without warning. That I caught my husband looking at me once, really looking, and for a second I thought he might finally speak. Instead, he looked away. That small gesture hurt more than any argument could have. It told me that whatever had broken wasn't something he planned to repair. That I don't know if our marriage ended that day or if it ended long before and I simply hadn't noticed. All I know is that the quiet we live in now is different. It isn't peace. It's avoidance. And every time I sit in that silence, I feel the weight of what was allowed to happen pressing down on me. Some betrayals don't demand endings. They demand endurance. They ask you to live with the knowledge of what you became when no one stopped you. And that, I've learned, can be far more punishing than losing everything at once.